The legitimacy of political power was based on law, nomos, and this law, as was the case with almost all early societies, was a mixture of custom, habit, morality, convention, and social expectations, almost always unwritten. For the Greeks, law, however much it might be formulated in writing and enforced by authority, remained dependent on custom or habit. For the Greeks, law was sovereign, and the citizens of the polis needed to be educated into that law. Law for the Greeks, as it has been for most people in history, was something simply given and coeval with and constitutive of their society. It was not something to be made or unmade, not least because the intrinsic and normative coercive power of the law lies in its being conceived of as holding from time immemorial. It was something permanent and abiding. The contemporary view of law, in contrast, is that law is a set of regulations constantly changing to accommodate itself to changing circumstances. Law was essentially negative, ruling out murder or fraud. And law was usually strict about religious observance because failing to give the gods their due was always a sign that worse was to follow. But beyond that, men were expected to compete for those things which men called good. If people lived as hermits, law is not needed, but if people are to live together without conflict or with minimal conflict, then law is essential. Law there had to be if social and political life was to be possible at all. Who should make that law and what that law should contain? These were highly contentious matters, then as now. If there is one thing for which the sophists are well known, it is the distinction they draw between nature and convention, between physis and nomos. Though the term physis is generally and correctly translated as nature, when contrasted with nomos, law or convention, it could, with profit, be rendered as reality. Is it better to follow the moral and legal rules of one society or to exist according to nature? The sophists systematically raised questions about morality and politics that set the agenda for subsequent philosophical debate, and Plato and even Aristotle can often be understood as responding polemically to sophist arguments. Aristotle, in his Politics, remarks that there are certain persons who hold that the control of slaves by a master is contrary to nature. He doesn't say who these people are, but it is more than likely that they were sophists. Garnsey remarks, the intellectual origins of the critique of slavery lie ultimately in the activity of the sophists. So, while the sophists do not constitute a philosophical school as do, say, the Epicureans or Stoics, so that there is no canonical set of doctrines to which a sophist must subscribe, it is nevertheless the case that the distinction between physis and nomos, nature and convention, or law, is more or less a constant theme of sophistic thought. That we have such a distinction is clear enough. Just what that distinction comprises is quite another matter. Roman even goes so far as to use the word libertarian to characterize some aspects of sophist thought. The sophist libertarian ideology, he says, directed in the name of the natural law against law and custom, called into question the value of the nomoi. There are at least two ways in which the nomos-physis distinction can operate, and it corresponds roughly to a division between the earlier and the later sophists. In one way, what is natural can be thought of as giving us an account of justice that is independent of and superior to the more specific and limited conceptions of justice that can be found in particular polis. This is how it appears in Sophocles' Antigone, in the famous passage where Antigone rejects the binding force of her uncle Creon's laws. Creon asks Antigone if she knew of his proclamation forbidding what she had done. She answers, "How could I not? It was public knowledge. But Zeus did not announce these laws to me, and justice living with the gods below sent no such laws for men. I did not think anything which you proclaimed strong enough to let a mortal override the gods and their unwritten and unchanging laws. They're not just for today or yesterday, but exist forever, and no one knows where they first appeared." Commenting on the sophists, Roman remarks, the sophists had much in common with the revolutionary natural law ideas of the 18th century Enlightenment. To the sophists, the laws were not venerable because of tradition, or by reason of having stood the actual test of life in the city-state. They were artificial constructs, and serve the interests of the powerful. And in so doing, they contrast the laws of the particular city-state with the natural law as they conceived of it. Hippias, for example, talked of unwritten laws that were eternal and unalterable and had a source above that of the municipal laws of the political community. But there is another way in which the contrast between nature and convention can be drawn. In this way of drawing the distinction, nature is not thought of as having a moral character, and so does not stand in judgment over the morality of the polis. In effect, this results in denying the status of natural to any social teaching. Notoriously, Alcidamas denied that any man was naturally a slave, and Antiphon, even more outrageously, denied that there was any natural distinction between Greeks and barbarians. In one of the longest fragments we have of any of the Sophists, Antiphon states boldly that all law is convention, and, as such, contrary to nature. One set of ways to characterize the distinction comes from Beardsley. He gives us 4 possible contrasts. Phusis as normal behavior, as distinct from nomos as erratic behavior. Phusis as indicating a class of self-moving things in contrast to things moved by external factors, nomos, and phusis as reality in contrast to nomos as opinion. The 4th contrast is more germane to our concerns. This is between phusis as one's natural character as distinct from nomos as one's character as modified by one's social environment. One of the most sophisticated, though by his own admission non-coercive accounts of the phusis-nomos distinction is that of Guthrie. He gives us a conventionalist view of the distinction that characterizes our original primitive condition as phusis and our civilized condition as nomos. Such might be the opinion of Protagoras. A realist view of the distinction would take phusis to be our native self-interest in contrast to our behavior under public inspection and social control, nomos. Such a view might be attributed to Thucydides and to Thrasymachus and Glaucon in Plato's Republic. A third, antinomian view is a more extreme form of the second, seeing phusis as our original condition of self-seeking by the strong and independent versus conventions, nomoi, that society attempts to impose on the strong. It wouldn't be inappropriate to attribute such a view to Callicles in Plato's Gorgias. Roman sees 3 revolutionary ideas emerging from the thought of the Sophists. First, there is the idea that the laws of the polis are artificial and tend to serve class interests. Second, there is the idea that all men are free and equal and are citizens of the civitas maxima or cosmopolis, which transcends the limitations of the local polis. And third, there is the idea that the polis is a non-natural entity, coming into being as the result of agreement and not originating by nature. It is easy to see how opposed such ideas are to the thought of Plato and Aristotle. Protagoras, 490 to 420 BC, a native of Abdera in the northeast corner of the Greek world, was among the earliest of the Sophists and is arguably the most famous of them. Only a dozen or so fragments of his work survive, but he features in Plato's Protagoras, Euthydemus, Cratylus, and Theaetetus, and is mentioned in Aristotle's Metaphysics and Rhetoric. He claimed to be able to teach certain skills in political matters. Such skills are necessary in any political community, especially in any democratic political community, and therefore worth paying to acquire. To the objection that perhaps such skills are not communicable or otherwise why would the sons of expert politicians not become expert, Protagoras simply responds that not everyone has the same capacity to be taught. He is often thought of as a relativist, someone to whom the truth of the matter is dependent upon whatever is doing the judging. He is perhaps most well known for his claim that, of all things the measure is man, of things that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not. This cryptic statement is capable of being variously interpreted, broadly as amounting to the claim that we have no access to non-human judgments on contested matters, or, more narrowly, to the claim that there is no way to distinguish between individual human judgments. On balance, it seems to be the case that what the man is the measure statement comes down to is a kind of commonsensical judgment that the common perceptions of ordinary people must be accorded priority. What Protagoras appears to have been contesting was the, to him, and to many others, metaphysical and unprovable claims about an unknown substance underlying all perceptible things. And just as he rejected this idea of a unitary principle underlying a changeable nature, so too he rejected the idea of a single natural human society distinct from the many forms of state and society he saw around him. To call him a relativist without qualification is to overstate the case. He does not appear to be a relativist in regard to matters of fact, such as that certain substances are poisonous to human beings. He is, however, a social or legal relativist, holding that whatever a given city holds to be just is just for it and its citizens. Odd as it may seem, this social or legal relativism leads him to espouse a fundamentally conservative and communitarian philosophy. Protagoras thinks that in order to live together as a single political entity, the members of the community must agree on a common measure and work constantly to ensure that it is effective. If indeed man is the measure of all things, then it is man in community who measures things in social and political terms, not some idiosyncratic individual. Those trained in the arts of politics will benefit themselves and, in so doing, will also benefit the city, being able to persuade to adopt rules and laws that are more likely than not to lead to their advantage. Private advantage and public advantage are mutually reinforcing. Protagoras endorsed no specific political regime, rejecting only tyranny, defined in the usual way as a system of government in which those who govern do so for their own advantage and not for the advantage of the community. Protagoras was of the view that all men, simply by virtue of family and social life, develop a measure of political insight which is capable of development through education. Even so, not everyone's views are equally worthy of respect. Among all who have some measure of political insight, some will have more than others, and those should be the ones to give a lead. Thus, says Kerford, an ideal Protagorean society is not ultimately egalitarian. It is to be guided by those with the most wisdom on each and any occasion. Despite this elitist bias, Protagoras' theory is still democratic. Not so that of Plato, who believes that by and large your average citizen in the street has little or nothing to contribute by way of leadership. Gorgias was a contemporary of Protagoras. He came from Leontini in Sicily, a colony of Chalcidian Naxos, and so ethically was an Ionian. He was a brother of Herodicus the physician. He studied under Empedocles and taught Alcidamas and Antisthenes. Those influenced by him include Isocrates, Lycophron, Prodicus, Hippocrates, Pericles, Alcibiades, Critias, Proxenus, and Meno. By the standards of other pre-Socratics, we have a substantial amount of material from Gorgias. He wrote an anti-Parmenidean tract, the substance of which is that nothing exists. Even if existence exists, it cannot be known. If it could be known, it couldn't be communicated. He denied any intention of teaching his pupils arete, or excellence, his job being to teach people how to speak persuasively. At any rate, whereas rhetoric was in the curriculum of every sophist, Gorgias must have put it more prominently in his shop window than any of the others, says Guthrie. This art he saw as being morally neutral, concerned with means and not ends. Hippias belonged to the younger generation of sophists. He came from Elis, and so was a Dorian. He served as an Elean ambassador to Athens and claimed to have made lots of money from his teaching activities. Most of our knowledge about Hippias comes from Plato. He appears in the Protagoras, and in two dialogues called after him that may not be genuinely Platonic. While Plato shows genuine respect for Protagoras, and, to a lesser extent, Gorgias, and even seems to share some of Prodicus's predilections, he makes relentless fun of Hippias, who seems to be completely unaware of the ironical flattery to which Socrates subjects him. Xenophon called him a polymath, and he was said to have had a remarkable memory. He taught not only rhetoric but also astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, grammar, rhythm, music, genealogy, mythology, and history. It is claimed that he made some significant mathematical discoveries, though this has been disputed. Kerford says that his knowledge was not merely superficial, but was based on scholarship that was both wide and deep. Hippias seemed to be an early expositor of a theory of natural law. In Xenophon's Memorabilia, Hippias and Socrates agree that unwritten laws are divine and God-ordained. These laws are observed everywhere without negotiation or promulgation, and so cannot be the result of enactment, but must have their source elsewhere. This provides for an antithesis between this natural law and the positive law of particular political communities. In typical sophist fashion, he contrasted law, nomos, and nature, phusis, and came down on the side of nature, phusis, on moral grounds. He held that the divisions among the human race are artificial and a matter of nomos. In the Protagoras, Hippias intervenes in a dispute. He calls all those present kinsmen by nature, not by law. Law is a despot constraining men to act against nature. Little was known about Antiphon until the discovery in 1915 of two relatively large fragments from his treatise on truth, so that, unlike his fellow sophists Protagoras and Thrasymachus, we have some relatively substantial material to reflect upon. Antiphon draws the standard sophistic distinction between phusis from nomos, his particular take on the distinction being that not only are nature and convention different, they are also in fact opposed. He seems to have adopted a utilitarian and somewhat cynical approach to nomos, arguing that we should follow it only if failing to do so brings more pain than pleasure. Justice he defines as not violating the legal rules of one's city, or, as he adds in parenthesis, not being known to transgress those rules. These rules are conventional, not natural. We know this because every city has its own rules, and they are not all the same. They can't therefore all be natural, since what is natural is common to all. To obey the rules, then, is to go against nature, and no one should do so unless he is being observed, for then he is subject to shame and punishment. Those who transgress the laws of nature suffer evil consequences, whether observed or not. Those who transgress the laws of the city suffer only if their transgressions are witnessed. Not only do the rules prevent one from acting according to nature, and so are the opposite of life enhancing, they don't even protect those who do act according to them. The machinery of law, he says, cannot carry its own false presumptions into effect. Now, if those who adopted such courses received any help from the laws, or those who did not adopt such courses but took the opposite line suffered any loss from the laws, there would be some use in paying obedience to the laws. But as a matter of fact, it is obvious that legal justice is inadequate to help those who adopt such courses. It permits the injured party to be injured and the offending party to commit his offence. Even if the case comes to court, matters are no better. We rely for our knowledge of Thrasymachus on Plato's presentation of his ideas in the Republic. How accurate this presentation is, we cannot know, as we have no other source of information. He came from Chalcedon, a Megarian colony, and was a teacher of rhetoric who charged for instruction and travelled widely. Thrasymachus notoriously claims that justice is the advantage of the stronger. In every society, the rules are made by those with power, the stronger, and are always made to their own advantage. And since the rules determine what is just in the political community, justice is necessarily to the advantage of the stronger. If you are not one of the stronger group, acting justly is, by definition, to act against your own interest. Those who make the rules, or when they cannot make them, evade them, win. Those who follow rules made by others lose. Thrasymachus anticipates Hobbes in believing that the only right is the enactment of sovereign power. A version of the Thrasymacheian idea can be found in the speech of the Athenian envoys to the Melians in Thucydides. In the case of the gods, we believe, and in the case of humankind, it has always been obvious, that as a necessity of nature, Wherever anyone has the upper hand, they rule. We were not the ones to lay down this law, nor the first to take advantage of its existence. We found it already established, expect to leave it to last forever, and now make use of it, knowing full well that you and anyone else who enjoy the same power as we do would act in just the same way. It seems that Thrasymachus makes certain assumptions in the course of his argument. One is that each individual is isolated and competes with others for a limited set of goods. The interest of each person is his and his only, and there are no common interests. Politics on this conception is a zero-sum game in which my gain is your loss, and vice versa. This position, interestingly, is in stark contrast to that of his fellow sophist Protagoras, who had expounded a conception of justice that made it to be a communal and reciprocal matter. For Protagoras, politics is a positive-sum cooperative venture. For Thrasymachus, it is a zero-sum conflictual venture. Given Protagoras' social relativism, it is going to be difficult for him to defend himself against the Thrasymachian arguments. If justice is only what people collectively think it is, and if people think that justice is not for the collective good, then what ground does Protagoras stand upon? It is important to see that Thrasymachus is not advocating the crude idea that a physically stronger person has right on his side over the physically weaker. His point is political, not physical, and it is that each ruling group necessarily makes laws for its own advantage. The only thing all political systems have in common is that they all embody a struggle for power between those in power and those not in power. He vehemently disputes Socrates' image of the ruler as a kind of doctor whose actions are motivated by a concern for his patients. He substitutes his own image of the ruler as a shepherd whose concern for his sheep is to ensure that they are brought safely to slaughter. We know nothing of Callicles except what we read about him in Plato's Gorgias. Callicles was a politician and follower of the sophists rather than a sophist himself. But listening to him, one could fancy oneself listening to a younger, more energetic, and less restrained Thrasymachus. For Callicles, conventional morality is simply nomos, that has supplanted true morality that is based on phusis. This morality of nomos is a snare by which the weak trap and tame the strong. But nature makes it plain that it is right for the better to have the advantage over the worse, the more able over the less. And both among all animals and in entire states and races of mankind, it is plain that this is the case, that right is recognized to be the sovereignty and advantage of the strong over the weaker. Callicles believes that he is merely saying openly what everyone thinks in secret. Our public defense of morality is simply a mask behind which we conceal our true motivation. Callicles regards law as the effect of agreement made by the weak to defraud the strong. Conventional law supports a slave morality of equality. Inequality is the law of nature. The strong for Callicles are not just those who are physically stronger, but those who have dominant wills or personalities, like the virtù that Machiavelli saw in Cesare Borgia. We can draw a line of intellectual succession from Callicles to Machiavelli to Nietzsche. Callicles is a stout defender of liberty, perhaps too stout, failing to differentiate it from license. He prizes freedom as complete absence of external constraint. For him, a freeman is one who can do and can say whatever it is he wants to do and say. Libertarianism endorses freedom too, but recognizes an intrinsic limit that differentiates liberty from license. To be free is to be able to do whatever it is one chooses, provided that in so doing one does not trench upon the like liberty of others. Callicles seems to deny the limiting libertarian condition of non-aggression. Prodicus was an Ionian from Chios. He was born around 470 to 460 BC and came to Athens as an ambassador from Chios. Socrates describes himself as a pupil of Prodicus in the art of drawing fine verbal distinctions, and in his dialogue The Hippias he calls him his friend, with what sincerity one may perhaps question. Prodicus seemed to have been concerned, like Confucius, with the rectification of names. To Socrates, correct language was the prerequisite for correct living and even efficient government, and it may well be that this truth first dawned on him while listening to the one drachma discourse of Prodicus. Antisthenes was a pupil of Socrates and reputed to be the teacher of Diogenes and founder of the Cynic school. Before associating with Socrates, he had been a pupil of Gorgias. He seems to have been attracted by Socrates' asceticism, an attraction that would give credence to his being credited with being the founder of the Cynics, though this claim is in fact doubtful. Alcidamas was a native of Elea near Pergamo and a pupil of Gorgias. He is well known for his claim that God made men free and no man is by nature a slave. And finally, the most interesting of this miscellaneous group is Lycophron, a pupil of Gorgias, who held a night watchman view of the state that is startlingly modern. He held that the polis exists merely to prevent crime and to guarantee each man's right against all others.